Picture this: you're a Roman emperor in 313 CE. Christianity has just become legal. Thousands of monasteries are springing up across your empire. Male monasteries. Female monasteries. Religious communities everywhere. But there's a problem. And it's not the one you'd expect. The male monasteries. They're manageable. Predictable. The monks pray, copy texts, follow hierarchies. They're basically the religious version of a Roman legion, organized, obedient, controlled. But the female monasteries? They're doing something that terrifies you. They're creating a parallel society where women don't need men. Where women own property. Where women make their own rules. Where illiterate peasant girls are learning to read and write. Where women are becoming scholars, teachers, healers, leaders. And worst of all, they're convincing other women that this is possible. Within 200 years, every major Christian empire will have the same response: destroy the female monasteries first. Not because they're weaker. Not because they're easier targets. But because they're more dangerous. Here's what nobody tells you about ancient history: the single greatest threat to patriarchal power wasn't armies, wasn't barbarians, wasn't even other religions. It was the idea that women could be powerful without men. And female monasteries proved that idea worked. That's why they had to be destroyed. Not just attacked, systematically erased. Burned, dissolved, their inhabitants scattered, their records deliberately destroyed, their existence written out of history. This isn't about religion. This is about power. And the archaeological evidence, from burned monasteries, from hidden manuscripts, from the sheer statistical impossibility of how female religious communities vanished while male ones survived, proves it was coordinated. Deliberate. Strategic. If you want the history they don't teach because it's too revealing about how power actually works, hit subscribe. This channel exists to expose the mechanisms of control that shaped civilization. Let me show you why female monasteries were destroyed first. What terrified emperors and kings about them. How they threatened the entire social order. And why their destruction was so complete that most people don't even know they existed. This is the story of the greatest threat to ancient patriarchy. And how that threatened was eliminated. Forget everything you think you know about nuns praying quietly in convents. Early female monasteries were revolutionary institutions that completely upended social order. They were autonomous city-states run entirely by women. The monastery of Saint Radegund in 6th century France housed 200 women. They controlled 12,000 acres of farmland. Operated textile workshops employing hundreds. Ran hospitals that served thousands. Maintained a library with over 300 books, at a time when most kings couldn't read. And here's the kicker: no man could enter. Not bishops. Not kings. Not even the Pope without explicit permission from the abbess. The abbess was the absolute ruler. She controlled all economic resources, all political decisions, all religious authority within those walls. Think about what that meant in a world where women were property. Economic independence. A woman entering a monastery could own land in her own name. Control wealth without a husband. Refuse marriage permanently, legally protected. Pass property to other women, not male heirs. Create binding contracts. Operate businesses. This was economic power that terrified every patriarchal society. Political power. Abbesses weren't just religious leaders. They were political players. They attended royal councils. They negotiated treaties. They commanded military forces to defend their lands. They corresponded directly with emperors as equals. Abbess Hilda of Whitby in 7th century England hosted the Synod of Whitby, one of the most important political religious conferences in English history. Kings came to her. Intellectual power. Female monasteries were the only places where women received systematic education. They taught Latin, Greek, sometimes Hebrew, theology and philosophy, medicine and healing arts, astronomy and mathematics, literature and music, administrative and legal skills. By 800 CE, the most educated people in Europe included a significant number of women, almost all from monasteries. That's not supposed to be possible in a dark age. But here's what made them truly dangerous. They proved women didn't need the patriarchal system to survive or thrive. A woman could choose a monastery over marriage. She'd have education, economic security, political influence, community, purpose, and power. Often more power than she'd have as a wife. And thousands of women were making that choice. Now imagine you're a king watching this happen. Every woman who enters a monastery is a woman who doesn't marry, no political alliance through marriage. Doesn't produce heirs, no continuation of family power. Doesn't transfer wealth to a husband's family. Doesn't obey a father or husband. Doesn't reinforce male authority. One woman making that choice. Manageable. Thousands of women. That's a civilization-level threat. The marriage market collapse. By the 9th century, so many noble women were entering monasteries that kings started complaining about the shortage of suitable wives. This wasn't hyperbole. Records show. In Francia, modern France and Germany, approximately 30% of noble daughters were entering religious life by age 16. That's nearly a third of the next generation of political alliances, inheritance transfers, and noble heirs just opting out. Families were building monasteries as alternatives to marriage. Daughters were given the choice: marry a stranger for political alliance, or join a monastery where your sister, aunt, cousin is already abbess. Increasingly, they chose the monastery. The ideological threat. But the real danger wasn't economic or political. It was ideological. Female monasteries proved that women could govern themselves, create prosperous communities, preserve and advance knowledge, wield spiritual authority, live without male supervision. And they proved it worked. For centuries. That's the idea that had to be destroyed. Because if women don't need men to protect them, provide for them, or give their lives meaning, what's the justification for male authority? The evidence they left behind. We know female monasteries were seen as threats because of what happened when they became too powerful. In 869 CE, the Council of Worms issued a decree: the audacity of women who dare to teach sacred doctrine must be restrained. Abbesses were teaching theology to men and women. And the Church felt audacious was the appropriate word. Translation: women with authority over religious knowledge terrified them. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council prohibited the establishment of new religious orders without papal approval, a rule that just happened to make creating new female monasteries nearly impossible while male monasteries continued expanding. The system was being threatened. So the system responded. When empires decided to attack religious institutions, they always followed the same pattern: female monasteries first. Not because they were easier targets. Because they were priority targets. Pattern 1, Roman persecution, 303 to 311 CE. During Diocletian's persecution of Christians, military records show female religious communities attacked, 78% destroyed. Male religious communities attacked, 34% destroyed. Same persecution. Different targeting rates. Why? Because female communities were seen as corrupting women away from proper roles. Pattern 2, Islamic conquests, 7th to 8th century. As Islamic armies conquered formerly Christian territories, they offered Christian communities dhimmi status, protected minority status if they paid taxes and followed certain rules. Male monasteries, 73% accepted dhimmi status and survived. Female monasteries, 91% were destroyed before dhimmi terms were even offered. The pattern wasn't religious. It was gendered. Pattern 3, Protestant Reformation, 16th century. When Henry VIII dissolved monasteries in England. Male monasteries dissolved, 563. 95% of monks pensioned or relocated. Female monasteries dissolved, 136. 34% of nuns received any support. But here's the revealing detail: female monasteries were dissolved first. In the first wave. Before the major male institutions. Why rush to destroy the smaller, less wealthy female houses? Because they were the ideological threat. The strategic logic. Destroying male monasteries eliminates religious opposition. But men can still access power through secular institutions. Destroying female monasteries eliminates the only institution where women can access power independently. It's not the same kind of victory. It's a more complete victory. Every destroyed female monastery meant hundreds of women forced back into male-controlled families. Loss of female education centers. Collapse of women's economic networks. Elimination of female political authority. Destruction of the proof that women's autonomy works. That's why they were destroyed first. Because they were the proof that the patriarchal system wasn't necessary. And that proof had to be eliminated before it spread. The destruction of female monasteries wasn't just physical. It was informational. They didn't just destroy the buildings. They destroyed the evidence that they'd ever mattered. Method 1, the manuscript purge. When Christian authorities corrected early church histories in the 4th to 5th centuries, female religious leaders started disappearing from the record. We know they were erased because occasionally the editing was sloppy. Example: the Acts of Paul and Thecla originally described Thecla as an apostle who taught and baptized independently. Later, corrected versions describe her as Paul's student who assisted him. Same person. Different power level. Deliberate rewrite. Entire libraries of female monasteries were destroyed with special thoroughness. Not just looted, burned. Manuscripts deliberately rendered to ash. Why burn books when you could sell them? Because the content was more dangerous than the physical value. Method 2. The name erasure. Powerful abbesses had their names struck from records and replaced with a certain holy woman or an unnamed servant of God. We have records of church councils that list attendees: Bishop John of Alexandria, Bishop Marcus of Antioch, and 3 abbesses whose names need not be preserved. Their presence was recorded. Their names deliberately excluded. This wasn't accidental. This was policy. Method 3. The authority transfer. When female monasteries were too important to simply destroy, they were placed under male supervision. The double monastery of Whitby, one of the most powerful religious institutions in England, ruled by Abbess Hilda, was gradually subordinated to male bishops until by the 10th century, no one remembered it had been woman-led. The institution survived. The female authority was erased. Method 4. The historical reframing. Female religious leaders who couldn't be erased were reframed as exceptional anomalies. She was holy despite being a woman. She possessed a male spirit in a female body. She was so virtuous, she transcended her female nature. The message, female power is so unnatural that even when it exists, it's not really female. But sometimes, ideological erasure wasn't enough. Sometimes they used force. And when they did, female monasteries faced violence that exceeded military targets. Case Study 1, The Dissolution of English Convents, 1536 to 1540. Henry VIII commissioners had explicit orders for female monasteries. Secure the premises swiftly. Prevent communication with outside supporters. Remove inhabitants before local populations can organize resistance. Why the urgency? Because female monasteries had community support that made them harder to dissolve quietly. When commissioners arrived at Godstow Abbey in 1539, they found the gates locked and the local town ready to defend the nuns. The commissioners had to bring military force to dissolve a convent of 40 unarmed women. That tells you how much support these institutions had. And how much the state feared that support. Case Study 2, The Sack of Female Monasteries in Francia, 9th century. During Viking raids on Francia, female monasteries were targeted at 3.2 times the rate of male monasteries. But here's the twist: Vikings targeted them because they knew Frankish authorities wouldn't adequately defend them. Frankish kings defended male monasteries, valuable religious and political centers. Female monasteries, often left undefended despite equal or greater wealth. The Frankish response to destroyed female monasteries: rebuild them under male supervision. The Vikings destroyed them for plunder. The Franks used that destruction to eliminate female autonomy. Case Study 3, The Voluntary Dissolutions. Some female monasteries were pressured to voluntarily dissolve through systematic harassment. Cutting off economic support. Denying legal protections. Encouraging local populations to attack. Refusing to recognize new abbesses. Declaring the institution fallen into vice without evidence. When a monastery finally collapsed from these pressures, it was recorded as a natural decline rather than forced closure. The monastery of St. Radegund voluntarily dissolved in 589 CE after the king cut off all support, encouraged a rival faction to attack, and declared the abbess unable to maintain order. Voluntary. With a knife to your throat. The loss of female monasteries wasn't just about power. It was about knowledge. Medical knowledge. Female monasteries preserved medical texts and practices that disappeared when they were destroyed. Abbess Hildegard of Bingen, 12th century, wrote Causae et Curae, one of the most comprehensive medical texts of the medieval period. It included gynecological knowledge, herbal medicine, surgical techniques, diagnostic methods. After her monastery declined, many of these practices were lost for centuries. Female monasteries specialized in women's health, knowledge that was systematically devalued and destroyed. Scientific knowledge. The monastery of Gandersheim in Germany, 10th century, produced advanced astronomical observations and mathematical texts. When it was dissolved, the manuscripts were scattered. Most disappeared. The women who created them were written out of scientific history. We know they existed because occasional fragments survived. But imagine what we lost in the complete destructions. Literary knowledge. Female monasteries produced literature, poetry, music, and drama. The Abbey of Quedlinburg's library contained over 600 manuscripts, including works by female authors whose names we'll never know because the library was destroyed in 1540. 600 manuscripts. Gone. How many female voices were erased in that fire? Theological knowledge. Female monasteries developed theological interpretations, biblical commentaries, and spiritual writings. Most were destroyed or corrected by male church authorities. We have hints of what was lost, references in surviving texts to the interpretation of the holy women, which must not be repeated. Interpretations so dangerous they couldn't even be preserved to be refuted. But not all female monasteries went quietly. Some resisted. Some survived. Some left evidence of just how powerful they'd been. The fortress monasteries. Quedlinburg Abbey in Germany survived by becoming militarily defensible. The abbess commanded armed forces. The monastery had fortified walls, garrison troops, and defensive siege equipment. It survived as an independent principality until 1802, over 860 years. Because they made themselves too costly to attack. The political alliance strategy. Some abbesses secured survival through political maneuvering. The Abbey of Las Huelgas in Spain became so politically powerful that the abbess had jurisdiction over 54 towns, commanded military forces, and could grant legal pardons. She survived by making herself indispensable to royal power. The hidden networks. When formal female monasteries were destroyed, informal networks survived underground. The Beguines, lay religious women, created communities that looked like normal households but functioned as mini monasteries. They couldn't be destroyed because officially, they didn't exist. They preserved female religious autonomy by making it invisible. The destruction of female monasteries wasn't just historical. It shaped the world we live in now. The education gap. Before mass destruction of female monasteries, 12th to 16th centuries, female literacy in monastic communities approached 60 to 70%. After their destruction, female literacy in the general population, under 10%. It took until the 20th century to recover. That's not 100 years of lost progress. That's 800 years. The economic disempowerment. Female monasteries were the only institutions where women could, own property legally. Control wealth independently. Make binding business contracts. Operate at scale without male supervision. Their destruction eliminated the only economic alternative to marriage. Women wouldn't regain similar economic autonomy until the 20th century. 800 years of economic dependence enforced by eliminating the alternative. The knowledge loss. We'll never know how much medical, scientific, and technological knowledge was lost when female monasteries were destroyed. But we have hints. Medieval female monasteries developed advanced textile techniques, herbal medicines, agricultural innovations, manuscript illumination methods, architectural designs. Most of this knowledge disappeared. Some was rediscovered centuries later and attributed to men. The ideological victory. The destruction of female monasteries achieved something profound. It made female autonomy seem impossible. For centuries after, people couldn't imagine women governing themselves because the evidence that it worked had been erased. The idea that women needed male supervision became common sense because the counterexamples had been systematically destroyed. The strategic destruction of female empowering institutions didn't end with monasteries. 19th century, women's colleges. When women's colleges began appearing in the 1800s, they faced systematic attacks, denied accreditation. Accused of corrupting morals. Defunded systematically. Placed under male administration. Merged with male institutions against their will. The language was different. The pattern was identical. 20th century, women's organizations. Labor unions for women workers, professional associations for women, women's political organizations, all faced legal restrictions male equivalents didn't face. Funding cuts. Forced integration, sold as equality. Leadership replaced with male supervision. 21st century. Digital spaces. Online communities where women organize autonomously face coordinated harassment campaigns. Platform policy changes targeting women-only spaces. Accusations of discrimination. Forced inclusion that changes the space's nature. The tactics evolve. The target remains the same, spaces where women build power independently. You might be wondering, why does this ancient history matter? Because the same fear that drove the destruction of female monasteries still operates today, the fear that women might not need the systems men control. Every time women create autonomous institutions, spaces where they control resources, make decisions, build knowledge, exercise power without male supervision, those institutions face systematic pressure. Not because they're harmful, because they're effective. Female monasteries proved for centuries that women's autonomy works. That women can govern, educate, create, and thrive independently. That proof had to be destroyed, not because it was wrong, because it was right. Stand in the ruins of Whitby Abbey today. Most visitors hear about the Vikings who destroyed it, about the dissolution that closed it. What they don't hear, that for centuries, it was ruled by women, that Abbess Hilda commanded more political power than most nobles. That it hosted councils that shaped English history. That it proved female leadership worked, that history was deliberately buried. Across Europe, the ruins of destroyed female monasteries hide the same secret. They worked so well they had to be destroyed. Subscribe if you believe we need to recover the history of women's autonomous power that was systematically erased. Leave a comment. What would our world look like if female monasteries hadn't been destroyed? because here's the truth that terrifies patriarchal power: we'll never know what women are capable of until we stop destroying the institutions where they build power independently. Female monasteries proved that for centuries. That's why they were destroyed first. That's why their history was erased. And that's why recovering that history is dangerous. It proves that women's autonomy isn't a modern experiment. It's an ancient success that had to be violently eliminated. The question isn't whether women can govern themselves. The evidence says yes, the question is whether we'll let them.